First of all, I'd very much like to thank the organizers of the conference for inviting me to give this keynote. It's a great honor. You may know that my specialization is sign languages, particularly actually psycholinguistics of sign languages. And I thought it would be useful to take this opportunity to give you an idea, us all being linguists, about sign languages and their linguistics. Important for you yourselves if you don't already know, but also to give this information on to your students, because the more knowledge everyone has, the better the situation of sign languages and the deaf communities. So this is my topic for today. First of all, I'd like to make some acknowledgements. I have incredible gratitude for all the students and staff from the schools for the deaf that we have worked with in South Africa, and of course the National Institute for the Deaf. Many deaf informants and colleagues, far too many to mention by name, but I do want to particularly mention 4 colleagues from the University of Stellenbosch: Susan Yana, Imran Bodalaji, Ilse Aron, and Kate Huddleston. Really so indebted to all these people. So as linguists, we, of course, are fascinated by languages. And one of the fascinating properties is the diversity between individual languages. Students get really excited when they discover the diversity between individual languages. They find it so striking because it is so different from the languages that they know. But of course, for linguists, it's also interesting what the similarities are. These are intriguing. What do they tell us about human cognition, about universal principles of languages? So this is the approach that I want to take today. I want to consider sign languages in this way. So considering how sign languages are similar to spoken languages, but of course, how they are also different. The most striking thing, of course, is the modality, and this will be my first topic, but let's consider the range of topics. Let's just see what we're going to look at today. Modality, language acquisition, brain lateralization, iconicity, variation, verb agreement, syntax, negation, reciprocality, code mixing, stylistics, and language change. So, thinking about modality, what is true for spoken and sign languages, of course, they are all natural languages. They've not been invented, and they are acquired by children as a first language. But the difference is that sign languages are in the visual-spatial modality. That is, they are languages that we see, and they are articulated in space. And this is quite different, of course, to spoken languages, which are in the oral modality. They are heard, and they are articulated by the speech organs. And we can think, of course, that this can have considerable impact on the modality difference, that is, can have a considerable impact on many aspects of the linguistics of sign languages. But let's just see how far that is true. So the first aspect we're going to look at is language acquisition. What is the same is that children, whether they're deaf or hearing, and they're growing up in a family where a sign language is used, will learn that sign language in the same order and at the same speed as hearing children learning a spoken language. Remember the context that I've given, that is a family offering the same amount of language input and so on. And it's worth remembering that 95% of deaf children are born into hearing families. And those hearing families do not usually have a sign language in their repertoire, and therefore the input to those children is not the same amount or same quality as children growing up in a deaf family. But just taking that special case then of children having enough input, what is different? Well, deaf children can be a little earlier in producing their first signs. They can be. This has been the origin of the baby sign programs, which you may have picked up on internet. And this is because the motor development of the hands is faster than that of the speech organs. So deaf children can actually start to produce signs slightly earlier. They can. So if we just look at this table, you don't need to look at the detail, but you can see that the two columns in terms of what is happening at a particular age is incredibly similar. What is different is the first marking on verbs. This tends to occur slightly later compared to children acquiring a spoken language. Some minimal difference. Let me just show you a clip, a short clip from a deaf child, aged 2.5, who is growing up learning South African Sign Language. And in this clip, in the situation, Ava's mother has been away. She's been gone on a plane, and Ava is very pleased that she had a good flight, and they are now going home. So what we can see in this clip is that Ava is producing multi-sign sentences. So she signs mama, the sign she makes across her chest, fly, and finish. Just one example. She's also talking about the non-here and now, the flight that has passed. And what is interesting, as is absolutely expected at this age, is her phonology is still developing. The complex handshake, which is used in the noun flight, is not yet mastered. You can see how complex this handshake is. You can even try to do that yourself. And you see that you have to hold down the two middle fingers with your thumb. I'll just show you the clip of Aoife again. Let's move on to a topic where you may have an idea that in terms of brain function, well, sign languages are in a different modality. They make use of space. And we know that the right hemisphere is mostly dealing with space. So how does this work then in the brain? Well, in fact, sign languages, just like spoken languages, are processed predominantly in the left hemisphere. And if you get a lesion in the left hemisphere, this causes aphasia of the similar types that we find in spoken languages. So a Broca type aphasia, short sentences, not grammatically correct, and Wernicke, fluent, but semantics are not correct. What is different is that the right hemisphere is engaged to a slightly greater extent, and the signers have more activation in the back part of their brain, so more posterior activation in signers. Let's see what this looks like. Here you can see brain scans of 3 different types of participants. In the left-hand column, you are seeing the deaf British Sign Language signers. In the middle column, hearing British Sign Language signers. And on the right, hearing English speakers who do not know a sign language. And this is the brain scans which you get when you show signing to these different groups. And in the top row, you have the left hemisphere, and in the bottom row, the right hemisphere. Well, as you can see, the right hemisphere is not being very activated in this processing. The left hemisphere is, and the red circles are indicating that there is actually quite a lot of posterior activation in signers who know British Sign Language, and the hearing signers have far less posterior activation. So brain activation is slightly different, but of course it is predominantly in the left because sign languages are languages. Let's move on now to a different topic. A lot of people who do know nothing about sign languages think that it's some form of pantomime. And this has to do with the greater resemblance that there can be between a language and what it is representing in the visual modality. So iconicity, then, if we think what is similar between spoken and sign languages, is that both types of languages have iconicity. That is where the form reflects the meaning. But what is different is that there is much more iconicity in the sign language lexicon. There's also some iconicity in the grammar. Let's look at some examples. Well, firstly, let's consider iconicity in spoken languages. We have onomatopoeia and some idiophones where we find iconicity. But as we know, these are not the same in all languages. So comparing the noise that dogs make, if we look at these different languages, we see that they look quite and sound actually quite different, which is an interesting phenomenon. If we look at sound symbolism in spoken languages, this experiment has been done in many, many languages, showing speakers these 2 forms, these 2 abstract forms, and then the speakers are asked, which is the buba and which is the kiki? Now, think about your own answer. Most people say that the rounded form on the right is the buba, and the spiky form on the left is the kiki. And it seems that we have a sound symbolism which connects spiky forms to the vowels such as I, and rounded vowels, as you get in buba, more rounded vowels, more associated with the rounded form. I wonder what you thought. So, as we said, people are aware of the iconicity in the lexicon of sign languages. And what we know is that one or more components, technically parameters of lexical signs, can be visually iconic. So let's look at this South African Sign Language, SASL sign for comb. Okay, well, if you were shown this sign on its own without any context, you would probably guess what it meant without knowing SASL. This is a highly iconic sign because the hand shape, the location of the sign, and the movement are all related to the meaning. It's what we call transparent. It's iconic and transparent. Let's consider this sign. Well, when you know that it means afternoon, you can see that there is some iconicity here. The hands indicate the position of the sun and the earth. There is iconicity, but the sign is not transparent. Here we see the sign for no. The location of this sign on the head is iconic. So it's the location which is iconic here. it is referring, of course, to the brain. And interestingly, in many co-speech gestures referring to thinking and dreaming and so on, this location will be used. Let's consider this sign. Okay, well, there is no iconicity in this sign. It is what we call arbitrary. Research has shown across sign languages about 30 to 50% of signs are judged to have some iconicity. So it's about half. This doesn't warrant the idea, of course, of thinking that sign languages are pantomime. There's more iconicity in verbs, which is an interesting aspect. And I'm now going to show you an example of where there is some iconicity in the grammar. The signer will be signing the sentence, "The book is laying on the table," or "the book is laid on the table." And first you see the signer signing table, then book, and then the verb. Show you again. The form of the verb lay includes what we call a size and shape classifier for book, and the movement is iconic. So here we see where some iconicity gets involved in the grammar, in the movement in this particular case. Okay, let's move on now to a different topic, the topic of variation. You may be thinking, oh, well, there's about 50% of signs are iconic, so probably there's not so much variation then between signs. Well, both spoken languages and sign language show considerable variation in the lexicon, far less in the grammar. Here, the types of languages are similar. And similar factors affect variation. So the age of your informant, the context in which signing is produced and speech is produced, all can affect variation. So in sign languages, what we see is that they show a strong effect of school. Of course, we know regional variation, but in fact, in sign languages, the school specifically has a strong effect. And this is called schoolization. And this has to do with the way deaf education is organized. So deaf schools have been set up by different institutions. On the one hand, a Catholic institution, on the other hand, a Protestant organization, and so on. And because of this way that deaf education is organized, often schools have little contact. Show you some examples from SALS. Here's the sign for sit. Okay. The signer is demonstrating the lexical sign and then putting it in a context. This is from a signer from an Eastern Cape school. Here's another Eastern Cape school. What you can see is these schools have quite different signs for this lemma, but in fact, these schools are not very far apart in the Eastern Cape, confirming this idea of schoolization. Okay, now quite a different topic. I'm going to think about morphology in sign languages, in particular verb agreement. What is similar is that both types of languages can show verb agreement. They can, but both vary in the extent to which this occurs, according to the type of language and so on. In sign languages, all sign languages studied so far can mark both subject and objects. So this is not true for all spoken languages. Sign languages are of this type. And some verbs within a sign language do not allow agreement because of their phonology. Okay, let's take a look at some examples. I'm going to show you the paradigm of the verb give from Sign Language of the Netherlands, abbreviated NGT. And what you see is, in terms of the movement of the verb, the subject is marked by the initial position of the verb, and in this case, the indirect object by the final position. I'll show you the paradigm. Okay, I'll just talk you through it. I give to you, you give to me, I give to that person, and that you give to the other, to her or him, and he or him gives to him or her. Okay, so you can see how the locations in space are used for indicating person of the verb in both the subject function and the object function. Let's show you an example from SALS. This will be the sentence, she gave him or her a big heavy book. Okay, so what you see is here the verb give moving from location 3b to location 3a, indicating a third person subject and a third person indirect object. Okay, and there are more verbs than the verb give, of course, that show agreement. Let's just look at this verb. This is the verb buy. And this is a non-agreeing verb in SALS. It cannot show agreement. And why is this the case? It is because it is body anchored. The one hand, the non-moving hand, the non-dominant hand, is the location to which the moving hand, the dominant hand, moves. And so it is body anchored, and it cannot be moved around in space to show agreement. Okay, this is an object of, or a subject of current research in SALS. Okay, let's go from morphology into syntax. Spoken languages and sign languages both have a hierarchical structure. But sign languages have considerable more simultaneity, things happening at the same time. Let's show you how this works for negation. Marking negation is a universal property of human languages, and sign languages are no exception. So, of course, we have negative sentences in sign languages. What is different is that sign languages have a non-manual marker of negation. Some also have a manual marker, but in some sign languages, the non-manual marker can be used on its own to mark negation. And South African Sign Languages is one of that latter type. Here you're going to see the signer signing, the work is not finished. If you look at the transcription, you can see how the signer first signs work, and then the verb and the head shake, which is the non-manual marker, goes across that verb. I'll just show you again. Okay, so this is an example of simultaneity of structure. Reciprocals are also an example of same and differences in syntax. So spoken languages and sign languages can mark reciprocality in different ways. So in English, we often use the pronominal form each other. But sign languages frequently use a simultaneous structure involving the movement of the verb. Let me show you an example from German Sign Language. By the way, South African Sign Language works the same way. Here we're going to see the sentence, "We give flowers to each other." And you will see that both the left hand and the right hand are involved in expressing that reciprocality. I'll show you again. Okay, so here again, we see simultaneity of structure embedded in the verb is this reciprocal. Okay, now something a bit different. This is code mixing. Okay, so what we can see in spoken languages and sign languages is that code mixing can occur. So for example, you can insert a word or sign from a different language. So I'm speaking English to you, but I might suddenly decide to use a French word in the middle of my sentence, assuming that I thought you would understand French. So this sort of code mixing we're very familiar with in a multilingual society. Code mixing is a very common phenomenon. But what is different in sign languages is that a sign language and a spoken language can be produced simultaneously at the same time. And this leads to a phenomenon which actually has got a different name, which is code blending. And you have different types of code blending, where both the signed utterance and the spoken utterance, here the ball is falling, are articulated at the same time. And this one is called full because the proposition, the content, semantic content is expressed fully in both sign and spoken language. Another type is where one language is dominant, what is called spoken base language. So here you have the utterance that is going to fall, and in the signed part, it is only the verb fall, which is signed. The full utterance is expressed in spoken language. So the spoken language is here, the base language. Of course, this can be the other way around. You have a signed base language. So you have, he has a blue coat. The full utterance is expressed in a sign language and only spoken is blue. And here the sign languages express the full proposition. A really intriguing part of code blending is where the two modalities actually are mixed to convey the full proposition. And here we see that what is spoken is the adjective yellow, what is signed is doll play, giving the full proposition, I want to play with the yellow doll. It is the most complex form of code blending since both modalities are being used. Here I'm going to show you an example of code blending so that both Mark here at age 6 and his mother are deaf. And you can see in the clip that Mark is using mouth movements. What you see is that Mark is articulating some words, but not very many. He's not using his voice with his deaf mother. This is a typical example of a deaf child growing up to be what is called bimodal, bilingual. So he is using 2 languages in 2 modalities, and most deaf people are, in fact, bimodal, bilingual. Okay, stylistics. We use different styles in the way that we speak. I'm speaking to you in a formal context, so I'm using a more formal style of English. And these differences in style are prevalent in both types of language, and they can be marked in many different ways. What is different in sign languages is that, for example, if you only sign with one hand and you involve 2-handed signs in that signing, it's seen as informal style. And there isn't really an equivalent in the spoken language modality. And poetry has its special modality-based conventions. And so this is what I want to show you now. I'm going to show you a poem called Soweto in South African Sign Language, composed by Modiegi Moyeme, and she is also performing this poem. I'm just going to show you the poem first of all, without telling you anything about it, so that you just get a completely undirected impression. So this poem is describing the rhythm of life and the closeness of the community in Soweto, describing how people wake up, the fires are made, create smoke, people go off to work, go off in the taxis, come back. And the signer is signing the poem, but at the same time is actually being the community. So it's incorporating the community in her signing and the emotions. And what we see is the use of the repetition of house and the classifier people leaving and returning, the rows of fires and smoke. And this emphasizes the pattern of life. And we see actually considerable use of 3 repetitions, which we, of course, know is a rhetoric device. The hand-shaped house, just show you here, is usually with pointed fingers. And what we see here is the use of house with the hands curved. And this actually reflects the emotional content of the houses, the coziness, the comfort, the security. We see a change of rhythm. The rhythm slows down when the township is sleeping, and this emphasizes the peace. And we see this special device, what's called anthropomorphism. The houses and the signers stand for Soweto and are the spirit of the township. So I've given you this analysis, so you are, in a sense, more informed. So let's just look at the poem again. Now we're going to move on to our last topic for this presentation, that is considering language change. Well, it probably won't surprise you that all languages can change due to external influences, but some languages have an endangered status, and this can be due to many different factors. What is different for sign languages is that sign languages are inherently endangered because the transmission of sign languages from one generation to the next depends on educational settings. So children will, as we said before, 95% of children are born into hearing families. The context in which they are exposed to a sign language is that of education. And if there is a change in policy in the educational settings, then the sign language can become endangered very quickly. You also get sign languages, or in the educational context, the decision to use, as has happened, for example, with the Inuit Sign Language in North Canada, that schools will be taught using American materials and importing teachers from America using ASL. So the native Inuit Sign Language is actually dying out. So as I said, sign languages are extremely vulnerable. Let's consider then some aspects of linguistic change, which affect both types of language. So sharing scientific knowledge leads to the borrowing of terms, and this happens in sign languages too. So let us look at the BSL sign for this British Sign Language sign for Neptune. I was just delighted and amazed when I first saw this sign, because what I did not know was that Neptune has many moons and that most of the moons go round the planet in one direction, but one goes in the other direction. And this is what you see here reflected in this sign. Okay, so it is highly likely that this sign, which was made for a scientific dictionary of British Sign Language terms, will be borrowed and used in other sign languages. You can also get changes in political correctness. If you look at this sign here from American Sign Language for India, you will probably recognize that the iconic element is referring to the red dot, which most of people of Hindu religion have on their forehead. And this is no longer seen as politically correct because, of course, India has many different religions. So it's no longer considered appropriate. And this sign is gradually becoming obsolete, being replaced by a different sign for India. As I said, sign languages are particularly endangered. But actually spoken languages too, 40% of the 7,000 spoken languages across the world are endangered. And of the 300 sign languages that we know about, the majority are threatened due to these changes in educational system and the reliance from the medical profession on cochlear implants. Cochlear implant being a device which gives access to oral information. So sign languages also extremely threatened. And what we also know is, as linguists, that knowledge about languages is a great tool in helping support endangered languages. So this is really, I hope, stimulating you today to spread what you have learned and what you maybe already knew about sign languages to your colleagues, to your students. You can incorporate bits of information about sign languages in your regular lectures, because this knowledge, which we are helping to spread, will support these endangered languages. Thank you very much indeed. If you do want to know more, there is an introductory textbook, The Linguistics of Sign Language, which you can refer to.